dust-choked wind whispered across the parched plains, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the heavy weight of forgotten dreams. Ilara stepped down from the weary wagon, her gaze sweeping across the ramshackle ranch, a collection of weathered wood and sun-bleached stone that seemed to sag under the immense sky. Her worn satchel, clutched tight against her side, held the meager remnants of a life that had been fractured long ago, a life defined by an absence that gnawed at her soul like a persistent drought. This place, isolated and stark, promised only arduous labor, a desperate exchange for coin, yet she had come, driven by a flicker of something akin to hope, or perhaps simply the exhaustion of endless wandering. The advertisement had been vague, seeking a cleaner for a remote ranch, the owners described only as 3 men of the land. Her stomach churned with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, almost apathetic resolve. She had learned to expect little from the world, and to give even less of herself away. Her heart, a scarred and guarded fortress, had been built brick by painstaking brick over 2 decades, each stone a memory of loss, each mortar a residue of unyielding sorrow. It beat now with a slow, measured rhythm, betraying nothing of the tumult within. The air thrummed with the lowing of cattle, the distant thud of hooves, and the creak of an old windmill, a symphony of desolation that was both alien and strangely comforting in its raw honesty. She watched as a figure emerged from the main cabin, tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette framed against the blinding afternoon sun. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who belonged to this harsh landscape, his gait a testament to years spent mastering its unforgiving rhythms. There was a raw, untamed quality to him, a silent strength that prickled at the edges of Ilara's carefully constructed composure. She straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting instinctively, a subconscious act of defiance against the weight of her own history. She had come here to clean dust from floors, not to stir up the dust of old wounds. Yet an invisible thread, thin as a spider's silk, seemed to pull her towards him even before they exchanged a single word. A flicker of something undefined, a phantom echo from a long-buried past, danced at the periphery of her awareness, a ghost that she quickly, ruthlessly dismissed. This was a job, nothing more. It had to be. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The man introduced himself as Elias, his voice a low rumble, weathered like the land itself. His eyes, though shadowed by the brim of his hat, held a piercing intensity that seemed to peel back layers of Ilara's carefully constructed indifference. She offered her name, her voice flat, devoid of the emotional nuances she had long since learned to suppress. 2 other cowboys emerged from the barn, gruff and laconic, their gazes sizing her up with a blend of curiosity and suspicion that she had encountered countless times before. They were the typical faces of the frontier, hardened by sun and toil, their expressions masks carved from years of silent endurance. Ilara saw them for what they were, reflections of a world that had never been kind to those who stood outside its narrow lines. She was a woman alone, a woman of color in a landscape that often saw her as little more than a shadow, and their initial scrutiny was a familiar burden. Elias, however, held her gaze a moment longer than the others, a subtle intensity that gnawed at the edges of her resolve. There was a quiet strength in him, a profound weariness etched into the lines around his eyes that hinted at a history as complex and burdened as her own. The cabin was a testament to masculine neglect, a chaotic tapestry of dirt, discarded tools, and the lingering scent of stale coffee and saddle leather. Ilara moved through it with a detached efficiency, her hands calloused from years of similar labor. Each sweep of her broom, each scrub of the washboard was a rhythmic meditation, a way to silence the clamor of her own thoughts. Yet the silence of the ranch was a deceptive thing, punctuated by the clatter of pots, the distant shouts of the cowboys, and the unsettling quiet of Elias's presence. He was often nearby, repairing a fence, sharpening a tool, his movements fluid and powerful. She would catch glimpses of him, the way he held his head, the curve of his hands, and a faint, unsettling tremor would run through her. It was a familiar ghost, the echo of a memory she had tried so desperately to bury. A boy's laugh, a hand reaching for hers in the desperate chaos of a moment long past. She pushed the thoughts down, deep into the recesses of her mind, locking them away with the same brutal force she used to scour stubborn stains from the floorboards. To acknowledge them, even for a moment, would be to unravel the fragile piece she had painstakingly built. The irony was not lost on her. She cleaned to forget, yet the very act of living here among these men seemed intent on forcing remembrance upon her. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the setting sun, seemed to hold a whispered secret, urging her towards an uncomfortable truth. Days bled into weeks, each one a stark repetition of the last, yet the ranch slowly began to yield its hidden layers, much like the stubborn dirt she meticulously cleared. Ilara observed the men, their habits, their quirks. The other two, Jed and Silas, were predictable in their gruffness, their lives revolving around the demands of the cattle. Elias, however, remained an enigma, a man of few words but profound presence. She noticed the way he would sometimes hum a low, wordless melody while mending tack, a tune that pricked at the edges of her memory like a half-forgotten dream. It was an old Negro spiritual, one her mother used to sing, a mournful, hopeful echo of their shared heritage. She dismissed it as coincidence, a fragment of shared culture in a world where such fragments often intertwined. Yet, the melody persisted, an unbidden guest in the quiet corners of her mind. Then there were the hands. Elias's hands were strong, calloused, but she noticed a particular scar on the back of his right wrist, a jagged line that seemed to mirror one on her own, though hers was on the left. A childhood injury, a fall from a peach tree, a memory that tasted of summer dust and the sweet stickiness of fruit. Her breath hitched. She quickly averted her gaze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. No, it couldn't be. The world was vast, coincidences abounded, and to cling to such a faint spectral resemblance was a dangerous folly, an invitation for more pain. She had buried her brother Jasper years ago, mourned him in silent, solitary grief, a child lost to the chaotic tide of their displacement. To hope now, after so long, was a betrayal of the stoic resignation she had cultivated. It was a weakness she could not afford. The tension in the cabin, though unspoken, thickened with each passing day. Ilara found herself watching Elias more closely, her observations becoming less about her chores, and more about the faint echoes of the past that seemed to shimmer around him. The way he walked, a slight hitch in his left shoulder, the way he would absent-mindedly rub his thumb over the small, tarnished silver locket he always wore beneath his shirt, visible only when his collar gaped from exertion. A locket. Her mother had given Jasper a locket, a small, worn piece with an almost indistinguishable engraving. Her mind reeled, a whirlwind of doubt and agonizing possibility. The logical part of her screamed for caution, for denial. The raw, desperate part of her, the part that had never truly healed, dared to whisper his name. Jasper. The name felt foreign on her tongue, heavy with years of unspoken grief, yet it also carried a fragile, terrifying promise. The air grew thick with questions that hung heavy between them, unasked, yet pressing down with an almost physical weight. The discovery of the locket was a sharp, visceral blow, tearing through Ilara's carefully constructed defenses like a wild storm through a fragile lean-to. She remembered that locket with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade. It had been her mother's, then Jasper's, a small silver compass, its needle frozen, its surface worn smooth by years of anxious handling. It wasn't just any locket. It was the locket, the one meant to guide him home, even though home had ceased to exist the day they were ripped apart. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the scent of dust and leather suddenly overwhelming, morphing into the smell of burning wood and the acrid tang of fear. The year was 1863. The war, a distant rumble for most, had reached their small, quiet farm with the sudden, brutal force of a lightning strike. Smoke billowed against the impossibly blue sky, the screams of terror swallowed by the crackle of flames. 10-year-old Ilara, small and quick, had clutched her 7-year-old brother Jasper, pulling him through the chaos. Their mother, her face streaked with soot and tears, had pushed the locket into Jasper's small hand, her voice a desperate whisper. "Hold on to this, my brave boy. It will always show you the way back to us." Then came the shouts, the pounding boots, the flash of a bayonet. They were separated in the maelstrom. Ilara flung one way, Jasper another, swallowed by the swirling dust and the terrifying shouts of men. She remembered his small, terrified face, his eyes wide with a confusion that mirrored her own, his hand reaching before the crowd consumed him. The memory was a recurring nightmare, a silent film reel of agony that played in the darkest corners of her mind, a wound that had festered, unhealed, for 15 years. She had searched for him, endlessly, hopelessly, through refugee camps, through newly freed settlements, always met with blank stares or pitying glances. Eventually, the searching became a silent, internal grief, a surrender to the belief that he was gone, another casualty of a war that had devoured so much. The memory receded, leaving Ilara breathless, her palms slick with cold sweat. Her eyes fixed on Elias's back as he chopped wood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe a morbid counterpoint to the frantic beat of her heart. He was so similar, yet so changed. The boy she remembered, slight and full of mischievous energy, had become this man, hardened and quiet, a shadow of the past she had long given up hope of finding. The scar, the locket, the humming tune, they were not coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle, shards of a shattered history that were now painfully, irrevocably slotting into place. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had spent a lifetime searching for him, and now he was here, within arm's reach, a stranger in every way but the undeniable truth of his blood. The burden of this secret, the terrifying prospect of speaking it aloud, settled over her like a shroud. The ranch became a crucible, forging a new, unbearable tension between Ilara and Elias. Every shared glance held an unspoken question. Every casual proximity felt charged with the electricity of potential revelation. Ilara found herself scrutinizing him with an almost frantic intensity, searching for any detail that would either confirm or refute the monstrous hope blooming in her chest. His movements, the subtle inflection in his voice when he spoke of the past, even the way he chewed his food, every small action became a potential clue, a fragment of a forgotten world. She watched him interact with Jed and Silas, the easy camaraderie of men who had long shared the desolate expanse of the ranch, and a sharp pang of envy shot through her. He had a life here, a new identity, one untainted by the chaos of their shared past. What right did she have to shatter it? Her cleaning became erratic, her focus fractured. She would stop, broom in hand, her gaze drifting to Elias, who often seemed to sense her scrutiny, his own eyes meeting hers across the room, holding for a beat too long before he would turn away. There was a guardedness in his expression, a deep-seated weariness that mirrored her own, yet also a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, a curiosity, perhaps even a nascent recognition. The silence between them, once merely the absence of sound, now resonated with the weight of unsaid words, heavy and suffocating. She longed to ask, to speak his name, but the fear of being wrong, of shattering the fragile equilibrium of their lives, held her captive. What if he wasn't Jasper? What if he was, but remembered nothing, or worse, wanted no part of the past she carried like a stone in her gut? The stark reality of their situation pressed down on her. Here they were, a sister and brother, unknowingly reunited after a lifetime of separation, living under the same roof, bound by blood yet separated by a chasm of unspoken history and the brutal truths of a nation that had torn them apart. The sheer irony was a cruel twist of fate, a dark joke played by a callous universe. She watched him one evening, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, the locket glinting faintly against his chest as he shifted. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped. A profound ache settled in Ilara's own chest, a mixture of recognition, sorrow, and an overwhelming desire to reach out, to bridge the impossible distance that stretched between them. The decision weighed heavily, a leaden burden in her heart. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the truth, when it finally emerged, would alter everything. The slow burn of their shared existence was reaching its boiling point, and soon the vessel would surely burst. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken words, a palpable tension that hummed beneath the surface of mundane ranch life, Alara could no longer bear the silent torment. The sight of Elias, the weight of his unwitting proximity, was becoming a physical ache, a constant reminder of the truth she harbored. One evening, after Jed and Silas had ridden out to check on a wayward herd, leaving the ranch in the hush of dusk, Alara found Elias in the stable, mending a bridle. The scent of hay and horse mingled with the oppressive stillness of the coming night. This was it. The moment had arrived, unbidden and terrifying. She approached him slowly, her footsteps soft on the straw-covered ground. He looked up, his movements economical, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of surprise in their depths. "Elias," she began, her voice a strained whisper, barely audible above the rustle of the horses. Her throat felt tight, constricted by the immense weight of the 15 years that separated them. He simply waited, his expression unreadable, a statue carved from the silent strength she had come to recognize. I noticed your locket," she continued, forcing the words out, each one a tiny shard of glass in her throat. Her gaze dropped to the small, tarnished silver disc peeking from beneath his shirt. "My mother. She had one like it. She gave it to my brother." She paused, her breath catching. The air was suddenly thin, suffocating. He was lost when we were children, during the war." Elias's hands, which had been deftly working the leather, stilled. His head tilted almost imperceptibly, his brow furrowing. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not just recognition, but a deeper, more profound shift, a dawning comprehension that slowly, painfully, illuminated his face. He reached a hand to his chest, his fingers closing around the locket, his grip tight. "This." His voice was rough, unaccustomed to such intimate conversation, carrying the low timbre she had noticed before. "My ma gave it to me, said it was meant to show me the way home." The words, simple and direct, were a punch to her gut. They were his words, words she had heard 1,000 times in her dreams, the echoes of her mother's desperate plea. A single crystalline tear escaped Alara's eye, tracing a hot path down her dust-stained cheek. This was not a dream. This was real. The air crackled with a silent, profound understanding. There was no need for grand pronouncements, no dramatic outburst. The truth in its raw, unvarnished simplicity hung between them, undeniable and overwhelming. The stable was plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft snorts of the horses and the frantic pounding of Alara's heart. Elias, standing utterly still, slowly lifted his hand, unbuttoning his shirt just enough to pull the locket free. He held it out to her, his gaze unwavering, a silent offering. It's been with me always," he murmured, his voice a low, almost guttural sound. Alara's trembling fingers reached out, touching the cold metal, her thumb tracing the faint, almost indiscernible engraving, a crude, childish J and E scratched into the back, a secret shared only by 2 small, frightened children and their mother. The shared scar on his wrist, the way his voice dipped when he was tired, the melody he hummed, all the disparate threads of coincidence suddenly wove themselves into an undeniable tapestry of truth. "Jasper," she whispered, the name of fragile sacred offering, tasting of dust and tears and a sorrow so deep it had become a part of her bones. He flinched at the sound, a subtle tremor running through his strong frame. It was the name of his past, a name he had likely not heard in decades, buried beneath the identity he had forged in the crucible of his own survival. "My name is Elias," he stated, his voice firm, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. I don't remember much before being found by a kind family. They called me Elias." The admission was stark, a painful testament to the trauma that had stolen his early memories, severing him from his true self. The irony was a bitter pill. She had held on to every scrap of their shared past, while he had been forced to shed them to survive. Alara's eyes welled, blurring the stable into a watercolor of pain and desperate hope. "I am Alara, your sister." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years, of separation, of unspoken grief. He stared at her, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a burgeoning recognition that slowly, agonizingly, began to bloom in the depths of his eyes. He saw not just a stranger claiming kinship, but perhaps a flicker of the child she once was, reflected in the adult woman before him. The moment stretched, vast and terrifying, as the raw truth of their connection demanded acknowledgement. It was a confrontation not just of identities, but of lives lived in parallel, haunted by a shared tragedy. The air vibrated with the enormity of the revelation, a silence that screamed louder than any words could. The past, buried deep, had clawed its way back to the surface, demanding its due. The revelation, while undeniably true, did not immediately bridge the chasm of 15 years. Instead, it exposed the vast, yawning void that lay between Ilara, who remembered every detail of their shared childhood, and Elias, whose earliest memories were shrouded in a protective fog of trauma. His initial reaction was not one of effusive joy, but a deep-seated wariness, a cautious pulling back. The man Elias had become was a survivor, his defenses honed by a life of self-reliance. He had built his world, brick by arduous brick, without the ballast of family, and this sudden seismic shift threatened to crumble it all. "You say we are brother and sister," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, yet his eyes betrayed a profound turmoil. "How can I know?" The question was blunt, direct, cutting to the core of Ilara's pain. She had carried the burden of their past, nurtured its fragile memories, while he had been forced to shed them to survive. "The scar," she offered, her voice barely a whisper, pointing to her own wrist, then to his. "From the peach tree. You fell and I carried you home. Blood on your shirt, peaches mashed in your hair." She saw a flicker, a fleeting spark of something in his eyes, a faint echo of recognition. Then she spoke of their mother, her voice breaking, describing the curve of her smile, the strength of her hands, the way she hummed the same spiritual he now hummed. Each detail was a painful testament to a world lost, a world he had forgotten. He listened, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his face a mask of internal struggle. The stereotypical societal figures of Jed and Silas, who had returned and were now silently observing from the stable entrance, their faces unreadable, only added to the suffocating tension. They represented the external world, its judgments and its indifference, standing in stark contrast to the intensely personal, deeply intimate unveiling unfolding before them. Ilara felt the weight of their gaze, the unspoken questions, but she focused only on Elias, on the brother she had lost and found. The raw emotion of the moment was almost unbearable. He was her blood, her history, yet a stranger, and she in turn was a ghost from a life he could barely recall, a painful reminder of a past he had been forced to forget. The cruel irony was that the truth, while desired, was also a formidable barrier, a wall built from years of separate trauma. The path to true reunion would be long, fraught with the lingering shadows of their fractured past, each step taken on the fragile ground of memory and profound sorrow. The silence after Ilara's poignant recounting was not empty, but heavy with the weight of unspoken grief and burgeoning recognition. Elias finally looked at her, truly saw her, his guarded expression slowly, painfully softening. The truth, once a terrifying possibility, now settled into the contours of his hardened life. A strange, uncomfortable fit. He nodded slowly, a single, almost imperceptible gesture, but for Ilara, it was a profound acknowledgement. "Ilara," he repeated, trying the name on his tongue, a name that belonged to his long-lost sister. A piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. It sounded foreign, yet held an ancient resonance. The emotional climax had passed, leaving behind a raw, tender wound. The journey to healing, however, was only just beginning. Elias was a man shaped by solitude and the harsh demands of the frontier, his emotions buried deep beneath layers of stoicism. Ilara, too, was a fortress of self-preservation, her heart guarded. They were two broken halves of a shattered whole, attempting to knit themselves back together across a vast expanse of time and trauma. Their initial interactions after the revelation were awkward, punctuated by long silences, yet infused with a new, tentative understanding. They spoke of small things, of daily chores, of the weather, but beneath the mundane words lay the unspoken knowledge of their shared blood, a silent promise of something more. Jed and Silas, though still laconic, treated Ilara with a newfound, albeit gruff, respect. They were witnesses to a profound human drama, their own hardened perceptions perhaps nudged by the raw emotion they had observed. The ranch, once a place of mere labor, now held the promise of an unexpected home, a crucible where family could be reforged. Ilara began to share more memories, small anecdotes from their childhood, details of their mother's gentle strength, their father's quiet wisdom. Elias listened, sometimes with a distant, faraway look, sometimes with a flicker of dawning recognition in his eyes, a tiny memory sparking to life. The process was slow, painstaking, like excavating a forgotten ruin, unearthing treasures buried beneath layers of dust and debris. The pain of the past was still present, a ghost in their conversations, but now there was also a fragile thread of hope, weaving its way through the remnants of their fractured lives slowly, carefully, binding them together. The bitter irony of their long separation began to soften, replaced by the quiet miracle of their reunion. The days that followed the revelation settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and profoundly altered. The tension that had once hummed between Elias and Ilara was replaced by a quiet, often melancholic understanding. Their conversations grew less guarded, more frequent, a slow unspooling of years of unspoken hurt and longing. Ilara spoke of the journey her mother made after Jasper's disappearance, the desperate search, the eventual surrender to grief, and her own lonely path through a world that offered little solace. Elias, in turn, recounted fragments of his own fractured past, the kindness of the family who found him, the struggle to make a life for himself, the solitude that had become his comfort. He spoke of the locket, not as a symbol of a lost past, but as a silent anchor, a small, tangible connection to a forgotten identity. He confessed to a persistent feeling of incompleteness, a sense of something profound missing, a void he hadn't been able to name until now. The ranch, once a backdrop for Ilara's solitary struggle, transformed into a nascent sanctuary. She no longer felt like a hired hand, but a part of something larger, a reclaiming of family that had felt impossible. The daily tasks, once burdensome, took on a new meaning. As she cleaned, swept, and cooked, she was not just earning her keep. She was building a future, brick by painful brick, alongside the brother she had mourned for so long. The relationship was still raw, still fragile, scarred by the brutal severing of their childhood, but it was real. They were learning each other, not as the children they once were, but as the adults shaped by the profound loss and resilience. The irony was palpable. The very circumstances that tore them apart had, in a strange twist of fate, brought them back together, though irrevocably changed. The setting sun often found them sitting together on the porch, watching the vast, indifferent sky turn from fiery orange to bruised violet. The silence between them was no longer oppressive, but a comfortable space filled with unspoken histories and the quiet promise of a future. The initial drama had subsided, replaced by the deep, resonant, emotional truth of their bond. They were not fully healed, perhaps never would be, the scars of their past too deep to ever fully fade. But they were together, two souls adrift now anchored to each other. The hopeful resolution was not a sudden burst of happiness, but a slow, steady dawn, illuminating the path forward. They had found each other across a lifetime of separation, proving that even in a world steeped in darkness and despair, the threads of family, however frayed, could ultimately bind, offering a flicker of light against the encroaching shadows. Their reunion was a testament to the enduring power of blood, resilience, and the relentless, often brutal journey towards finding one's way home.